Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Before we jump in, I want to give a big shout out to the Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. You're making this happen. If you guys have benefited from this podcast, you learned something, you enjoy it, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter, a patron. You can find the link in the description. That would be huge. Really appreciate you guys. Another way to support it would be subscribe on YouTube. Click the notification bell so you can find all the new episodes as they come out. Usually be 2 episodes a week, Mondays and Thursdays. And above and beyond, you can go over to Apple Podcasts, leave me a 5-star review and a comment. That would also be huge. Today's episode's another really exciting one. I say this all the time, but every episode has been awesome. I have with me Dr. Thomas Ward. We're going to be talking about his new Cambridge Elements book, Divine Ideas. So without further ado, let's just pull him in. Dr. Ward, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Parker.
I'm a little bit nervous to have you on because I haven't had anyone on who's had a better mustache than me yet, but here you are, and this thing is amazing, man. That's how long you've been rocking the stash?
Yeah, I grew out a beard in 2015 when I was traveling in Europe, and I don't really grow a very good beard, so when I got home, I shaved the beard, but then left the mustache, and meant to just kind of play a joke on my wife, but she liked it, so I kept it, and so it's been about 6 years now.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. My logo has my kind of beard and mustache in there, so I kind of made myself into a caricature. I can't really escape it, but my wife likewise likes it. I tried to shave it once a year ago, and she said no. So this is my look forever, I think.
Yeah. I asked my daughters last summer. I said, "Hey, would you mind if I shaved my mustache?" And they were adamant. So I'm stuck with it.
That's awesome. I love it.
I think I'm starting to go gray a little bit, and my guess is that once it gets all gray and wiry, I'll probably have a good excuse to shave it.
Maybe. I don't know. That might make you look even more wise, though. You'll get like the Commissioner Gordon type look, which would be sweet. Well, Dr. Ward, before we jump into your work on Divine Ideas, curious, how'd you get into philosophy at all?
Well, I went to Biola University. I enrolled in the year 2000, and I was already interested in thinking hard about my faith. Grew up in the youth group world, had done some apologetics stuff, was a huge C.S. Lewis fan, but just really kind of eager to learn about anything I could. So I got to Biola, took some classes in ancient literature and philosophy, and was just kind of starstruck by everything I was learning about. And I asked a beloved professor what he would recommend as the major to give me the best overall education. That's how I phrased it to him. And this was John Mark Reynolds, who's now the president of a college in Houston called St. Constantine's. And he said, philosophy, be a philosophy major, take other classes to keep yourself rounded out, but do philosophy. So I got the philosophy bug in the fall of 2000, and shortly after that, I thought, I think I want to do this for my whole life. So then just started angling toward the grad school track, and by God's grace and good luck, or a combination of the two, maybe they amount to the same thing in the end, I got a job. So here I am. But yeah, it was 20 years. I got tenure last year, and I was reflecting how it was 20 years between deciding what I wanted to do for a living and then actually becoming permanently employed.
That's a long time. Yeah. That's super wild. Well, so we're going to be talking about your new Elements book, Divine Ideas. And just wanted to ask, like, in your mind, is this a work of philosophy? Is this a work of philosophical theology, analytic theology? Does it fit nicely into a category? Does it kind of blend or traverse a few of them?
Yeah, I think that the topic itself is fits equally well in just straight up metaphysics.
Okay.
I wrote it more from a theological perspective. So I think of it as philosophical theology. I know there's, some people like to parse out the differences between phil religion and philosophical theology and analytic theology. And
Yeah.
I myself, while I am in all of those worlds, I don't care too much about the divisions, but philosophical theology is the expression I use to describe my own work.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, so I was talking with you online, and you were saying that you did your dissertation in hylomorphism. How'd you go from hylomorphism into divine ideas?
Yeah, good. So back in my Biola days, like I was describing earlier, after I'd been in philosophy for a while, I finally got around to reading some Thomas Aquinas, and was blown away by the philosophical rigor, the Christian faithfulness. It just seemed to combine everything I loved about the intellectual and religious lives. And so I really kind of parked myself in the Middle Ages
Hmm.
and branched out from there. And by the time I got to the doctoral level, writing a dissertation, I was interested in the topic of hylomorphism in general in the Middle Ages, and Aquinas was my home base. But the contingencies of finding a dissertation topic and trying to do something that
Yeah.
gives you a shot at saying something original led me to explore Scotus more than Aquinas on that particular issue, and that became the dissertation. But the broader kind of intellectual atmosphere that I had been absorbing since undergrad days was philosophical theology in the Middle Ages. I wrote a master's thesis on the metaphysics of creation in Thomas Aquinas, and that got me thinking about not just the created world as such, which plays into the interest in hylomorphism. What kinds of things are there in
Right.
this created world? But also the kind of vertical dimension of creation as related to its creator. So those sorts of questions have been in the background for a long time. The divine ideas stuff was, really as I was getting close to earning tenure and thought that I had done enough work in non-theological stuff, it was kind of treating myself to something that I'd always really wanted to go deep on, but was maybe a little nervous to do until I had established myself a bit. So.
That's funny. I've heard people say that you need to kind of do the other work, and then you get to do you've earned it, and you get to do more of what you want, especially if you're a Christian or a theist at all.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
I found so I did this incredibly deep dive into natural philosophy in the Middle Ages, and learned a whole lot of weird stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I've writing technical papers on the 4 chemical elements and how they interact with each other and all of this stuff, and stuff I'd never thought that I would spend my intellectual life working on. And there's some value, I think, to studying irrelevant things. It trains your mind to it's hard work, it's hard intellectual work, so it keeps you kind of mentally fit for one thing. But then it's also good as a historian of philosophy, I'm looking at a whole thought world that is in so many ways very, very different from the one that I inhabit as a 21st century person. And so getting into the weeds on the stuff that just seems totally weird or totally wrong is part of the overall quest to just understand how what made these people tick back then.
That sounds like some of the influence from C.S. Lewis there, where you want to be a man who's living out of time, and you can see the problems of today by studying history more. And I thought the same thing. I love Lewis, and he's helped me figure out. I want to be a man outside of time. I don't want to be so constrained by the questions of my day that I can't see the problems from today, or see, hey, maybe they had some really good ideas back then. Let's not be chronological snobbery or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. I remember my master's thesis supervisor was Marilyn McCord Adams, who passed away a couple years ago, and she used to say, "Don't be afraid of the weird stuff. If you want to do this history of philosophy, history of theology stuff, you gotta you got to embrace the weird.
That's awesome. You kind of got some weird stuff in this book that I want to talk about. I'm really excited to talk with you about. But okay, as we're going in, I guess, where does this tradition start? So most people think divine ideas, and they think abstract objects, and they go with Philo, and you broach this topic, but in my head, it's learning from D.A. Carson here at TEDS. He talked about devar or debar, the Hebrew word, and then my Hebrew professor, Mad Dog McGarry, Dennis McGarry, said the same thing. Then I saw a footnote, and you cited Carson as well, his commentary on John. Where does the idea of divine ideas come from? Is it genuinely in Hebrew thought before Philo?
I think that's stretching it a bit, or maybe you can't quite put the question to Old Testament authors until without some or readers of the Old Testament, until you have some sort of reference point of Platonism.
Okay.
So I think the Philo story is basically correct if by divine ideas we mean in lieu of Platonic forms, we have God's thoughts. That said, I mean the idea that that God's or the God's creation of the world is due to something mental rather than something procreative.
Yeah.
That idea goes way back in the history of religious thought. Where you get, if you go to the oldest sorts of texts that we know about, and there are really two choices. Either things come about through some sort of bodily activity, sexual intercourse or sweat or spit, or things come about from mental activity, words, thoughts, speech. The oldest kind of divine ideas reference that I could find is actually all the way back in ancient Egypt, where some of the older accounts of the genesis of the world from the gods have this ultimate origin in a single God who thinks things up and then speaks them into being. And in that sense, if you want to call that a divine ideas view, well, then I think that there is a good case to be made for an Old Testament divine ideas theory. And in the end, I said it's maybe anachronistic until you have some sort of convergence of Platonism with Jewish thought. But in the end, what's essential to the divine ideas view is that God is the sole ultimate origin of everything, including the ways that things can be, not just what there actually is, and that he is this origin due to his being a person, and so having thoughts. And then in that broad sense, then we can find divine ideas views in Old Testament authors, and much further beyond. Even in some of the Upanishads from India, you get certain views like this, not to mention the Egyptians and so on.
Okay. Well, you just mentioned there about personhood, but something that I thought was really unique and beneficial from your work is that you do focus on God as a person and the ideas here as creativity. And so you say, grabbed a quote from page 16, this Cambridge element, is therefore more an inquiry into the nature of God's creative thinking than the metaphysics of so-called abstract objects such as properties, propositions, states of affairs, or mathematical objects, which you end up treating here and there and making arguments for or against, which is really interesting. But I thought that was so fantastic that you wanted to focus on the creative activity, because so often in these kind of conversations, it's just kind of cramming the Platonic realm into God's mind, and then God's kind of the hub for these. And so most of the conversation is really on the abstract objects. And so I thought that was interesting. But what led you to think, you broached it a little bit already, but what led you to emphasize the divine ideas and the creative thinking and creation ideas rather than abstract objects?
I think mostly it's a product of the particular historical way in which I approach the topic.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, and as you've already alluded to, the contemporary discussion here starts with these metaphysical questions. What are abstract objects? Are there? Here are the views that someone could take about abstract objects, and then if you want to be a theist too,
Yeah.
then let's see which theory of abstract objects plays most nicely with theism.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly nothing wrong with that approach, but it's as someone out of my own time, it was just utterly foreign to me to start thinking about the topic that way.
Yeah.
One thing I've noticed about the whole classical tradition, by which here I mean the ancient philosophical thinking from Philo on and through the Middle Ages, that whenever any of these authors approaches the topic of divine ideas, it is always through divine creativity and thinking about, so to speak, the what God must be like, given that the world exhibits this rationally ordered structure. So God must be a wise architect. That's one kind of image that Philo uses, for example. Holding in mind the blueprint of everything. I mean, he originated that kind of direct, that full on kind of monotheistic Platonism. Thinking of these architectural metaphors that we advert to a lot when we're trying to explain God's creativity or a theistic view of divine ideas and abstract objects. We use these architectural metaphors a lot, and I think they ultimately come from Philo. But even in the Middle Ages, Anselm, Aquinas, Scotus, Bonaventure, I mean, all of these people are thinking about God as the creator. And so one thing I wanted to do in the book was not ignore the contemporary debate and the way in which the contemporary question is framed, but also not get too much into the weeds on that particular issue and just try to start from what I consider a more fundamental place, which is there's God, and there's a certain kind of awe and allegiance we owe God.
Yeah.
What are some of the what must God be like if he ought to be worshipped in that kind of unconditional and comprehensive way? And that's where I think you can get a kind of theological argument against there being abstract objects that exist independently of God. And then the task of cramming it all into God, as you put it, becomes not just a task of the metaphysician, but the task of a theologian and a Christian who's trying to give God as much honor as possible.
Yeah, man, that's fantastic. I love that emphasis and the starting point. So let's jump in on like divine ideas themselves. This is wild. You promised a metaphysical theory good enough for monotheism and good enough for metaphysics. I was like, hey, wow, that's a strong claim there.
Bold
What?
claim.
Yeah, seriously, what is a divine idea?
A divine idea is a thought of God's, one of God's thoughts.
Yeah.
And God presumably has thoughts about lots of things, himself most of all. And there is a tradition of Trinitarian speculation, of which I'm sure you're aware, that tends to associate, if not identify, the second person of the Trinity, the Son, or the Logos, with God's activity of thinking.
Yeah.
And so you have, at the very least, you have God's perfect thought of himself, which is so perfect it replicates divinity.
Right.
But then, presumably, God has, on the assumption that God is omniscient, God has thoughts of everything knowable. So then there's a question about, well, given that there's stuff right now besides God, like a whole world, God would have ideas of everything that exists.
Yeah.
And so we could talk about the divine idea of Parker, or the divine idea of Parker's mustache. But then, if we try to imagine a kind of logical moment prior to creation where there isn't anything besides God, what then is available for God to think about?
Right.
If he has an idea of Parker's mustache, it's not an idea that is in any way generated by the existence of Parker's mustache,
Right.
such that God is causally related to Parker's mustache in some sort of perceptual way.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't work like that at all. But then it would seem strange that if the mustache of Parker is one of the ways that things can be, that God, prior to the existence of the mustache, would be ignorant about it, as would be ignorant that it's one of the ways that things can be.
Yeah.
And so then that kind of gets you closer to this idea that even prior to creation, even if God had created nothing at all, there would still be God's thoughts about things God could create.
Yeah. Well, okay, yeah, and you motivated this problem really well. I was going to use light when God says, "Let there be light," but "let there be mustache" is even better because we both have mustache. There's this idea of Parker's mustache prior to all of creation in the mind of God. I think. What thoughts are thoughts have intentionality? I would say maybe say not, but what is that about? Like, what is that is it referring to nothing or to a potentiality, or what is that idea about?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is one of the more I think one of the more radical sounding claims that I ended up committing myself to in the book. I do think that the thoughts have to be about something.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what is there for the mustache idea to be about prior to God making any mustaches or things with mustaches?
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like we're stuck, right? But then but we're not. So I'm just willing to absolutely affirm, and here I saw one of your earlier episodes with Chad McIntosh, and he had a tinfoil hat on. I think you were talking about aliens.
That's right.
Here's where I maybe need to put on my tinfoil hat and just say God's ideas of things he could create but hasn't yet are ideas of himself,
Mm-hmm.
aspects of himself, facets of himself, ways that he might be imitable. There are different ways of teasing out all of this, but that all of God's ideas of possible creatures are ideas of himself.
Yeah.
And this does a couple of, making that claim gives you two different but related things. One is to answer the question that you yourself just asked, which is, if there aren't any mustaches, what's God's idea of a mustache about? So we get an answer there. But then it might seem ad hoc if I just say, well, ideas are intentional, and so if I'm going to say that God has an idea of a mustache, I gotta supply something, and there's nothing else, so God. Okay.
Yeah.
But the second thing that this thought that God's ideas are about himself delivers to us is a kind of account of why there can be what there can be. One kind of hackneyed sort of Platonism
Mm-hmm.
just makes it completely primitive that there are the forms that there are, or the abstract objects there are.
Yeah.
So the form of the mustache, it's just an eternal occupant of a Platonic realm.
Just a brute fact.
A brute fact, and
Yeah.
it just seems strange that something so Well, the mustache just doesn't seem to have the right kind of heft to be in no need of explanation.
Sure.
Now, what my view kind of gives us ultimately is not a full explanation of the mustache that just magically delivers an account that leaves no further questioning or wondering.
Yeah.
But it does kind of park the mustache somewhere. Did you like what I did there? Park the mustache?
That's great.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So the thought is that God has the right kind of infinitude of being to be the ultimate explanation of why there can be anything that there can be. And so to think about, light as the example that I use in the book, and that, light has this kind of primordial, powerful, symbolic resonance for us. And so it doesn't seem too crazy.
No, that's exactly. That one was nice. It's like, okay, God is light. We have that in scripture. That's fine.
Yeah.
But then the mustache is like, okay. And I also want to touch on like lions. So let me just drop this into you say God something like this. I may be paraphrasing. God includes all the creaturely ways of being.
Yeah.
And so there's like the nice lioness, right?
Yeah.
That it's not like the lioness doesn't refer to just a proposition in God's mind, but to himself.
Yeah.
So we got mustaches, lions, and also light, which is the easiest one. But
yeah, that's right. I mean, I was interviewed by someone else, and instead of mustaches, we talked about mud. So
okay.
it's like, huh? So you're like, so God's like mud? Yeah, I guess so. Now there's one way in which we can just totally metaphorize all of these things and say, well, God is like a lion, and what that means is, lions are fierce and strong and overwhelming in their power. And so by thinking of the lion in that way, we can get some, the lion is theophanous.
And that's like Christ's lion of the tribe of Judah. That's in the metaphorical way, or maybe in an analogical way. But that's not what you're talking about here.
I'm saying something a little stronger. Yeah. The metaphors are ripe for. I mean, it points us in this direction. Especially the Bible gives us so many images of God that, of course, in some sense, we shouldn't identify God with a lion, much as we might admire the Chronicles of Narnia and the character of Aslan.
Right.
It's somehow not. It's not to be inferred that God is both a lion and a lamb, like those creatures crawling over there. Okay, so in some sense, there's a difference between the way that God is leonine and an actual living, breathing lion. But the motivation here for saying that God has a leonine aspect that is more than metaphorical comes from the fact that there is something distinctively lion-y about being a lion that can't be eliminated with reference to more general categories under which the lion might fit. So we can say a lion is substance, and so in that sense is like God, because God is a substance. A lion is alive, and so in that sense is like God. And you keep drilling down until you get to the distinctively lion-y features, and say, well, here are ways of being. The tawny hair, the golden mane, or whatever. Here are ways of being. They stand in as much need of explanation, an explanation of why these are among the ways that things can be, as the higher order, more magnificent stuff, like being a substance or being living. So even though we do have to end up saying that there's we do have to talk about God including with himself literally all the creaturely ways of being. And that is startling. It's just the natural progression that motivates divine ideas of of substances or living things in the first place. Let me try to back up a little bit there. So,
so I wrote down one thing that helped me see it wasn't as crazy. I like the weird stuff too, so I wasn't like angry or anything. Some people
yeah,
might go, "Hey, well, you don't have a creator creature distinction." I think that you probably do, and we could talk about that. But I was just excited to hear something that seemed crazy to me from someone who's not crazy. But then I think you motivated it pretty well by talking about the attributes of God, and you discuss wisdom, and so I think you're very wise. You're not wise in the same manner that God is, and so there's an analogy or direct correlation or some kind of relationship that you can motivate this. I don't know how to pronounce it. Leonness. Lioness. I don't know how to say that, but there's a kind of correlation between the lion exhibiting lionness and the wise philosopher exhibiting wisdom, and both ultimately are grounded in God or in God's nature, maybe.
yeah, that's exactly right. And if that sounds crazy, it doesn't sound crazy for wisdom, but it does sound crazy at
Right.
first for lion stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that you get there is by considering, you know, it makes sense for wisdom to be. It makes sense to think that wisdom is included in what God really is as a divine attribute,
Mm-hmm.
not just um, because it's one of the traditional divine attributes, but
Right.
because if God didn't already have wisdom about himself, that if wisdom wasn't something intrinsic to God, then when God makes wise things, either he's making irrationally, he doesn't know what he's making when
Yeah.
wisdom pops into the world,
Mm-hmm.
or he's drawing on something outside of himself
Right.
to learn about what wisdom is. And
Yeah.
then, having discovered the nature of wisdom, he then, as a creator, can go and make things that are wise.
And then you fall
So,
right into the Euthyphro dilemma there.
well, yeah. But if you're thinking about how wisdom must be included in God, not just from the perspective of the traditional list of divine attributes, but from conditions that must be met in order for God to be a rational creator, then you have to end up saying the same thing for the much more homely sorts of ways of creaturely being. And that's where I'll say, yeah, fine. Whatever the whatever the mudness of mud is, or the lionness of lions are,
Mm-hmm.
all of these ways of being are hidden in God. Why do I have to say that? Well, because God made a world in which these things come to be. And if there's real reality to them, then God knew before he created anything that these were among the ways that things can be. He intended to make a world that would exhibit these properties. And therefore, we have to say, either he got that knowledge from something besides himself, or he got it all on his own.
Yeah.
And I think it does God more honor, not to mention offering a simpler metaphysics to say that God just gets it from himself, not from
Mm-hmm.
anywhere else.
Okay. So, in considering Aquinas, I'm getting a little feedback there. Okay. No, I'm still hearing a little bit. I'll just keep running. It's getting better. Yeah. So, in considering Aquinas and his treatment of the attributes, and he uses analogy, right? So wisdom, the wise philosopher is he's wise, and the wisdom there is analogous to God's. It's not univocal, not equivocal. Is the do you like that? And second, is the lioness that is instantiated in the lion at the zoo, is that univocal to a lioness in God, or is it like following Aquinas analogical?
Yeah, good. Um, I so there's this supposed to be this big debate between, Scotus, who supports univocity, and Aquinas, who supports analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that there's a lot to this debate. I really don't. And I know I don't have enough time to fully defend that. And so to certain listeners, it will sound like yet another crazy thing that I'm saying. But when Aquinas argues for analogy, he rejects univocity for what seems like a strange reason from the perspective of the Scotist, or someone who supports univocity of the sort that Scotus supports. Aquinas rejects univocity of terms we use about both God and creatures because he rejects, rightly, that the causal relationship between God and creatures is univocal.
Right.
Now, this way of thinking about causal relations as univocal or equivocal sounds strange from the perspective of contemporary philosophy of religion people who know something about the religious language debates.
Yeah.
But it was a perfectly normal way of talking about causation for Aquinas. To be a univocal cause of an effect is simply to have the same nature as the effect that you cause.
Yeah.
So it's univocal in that sense. And Aquinas rightly denies that the God-creature causal relationship is univocal, because no creature has the same nature as God. And then infers from that all the language that we use to talk about God can be only at best analogical and not univocal. But he lays down as a condition for whatever he might mean by analogical language, that the meaning of terms is sufficiently preserved across uses for God and uses for creatures, that we can still have valid deductive reasoning. Scotus, when he says some of our language about God is univocal, the only thing he is thinking about is preservation of validity.
Right.
So I do think that there are certain metaphysical issues that ramify from the different answers that Aquinas and Scotus give on this question, but at the core, sufficient unity of meaning to preserve validity. That's what both care about.
Right.
Aquinas calls that analogy. Scotus calls that univocity.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's a lot
of literal. Yeah. You can still speak literally. That was something they both wanted to emphasize. Otherwise, there's you're equivocating.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, when it comes to divine attributes, Aquinas says, yeah, we are speaking literally. The thing that we are speaking about, God himself, exceeds any sort of infinitely exceeds any kind of concept that we could form of whatever attribute we're applying to him. Mm-hmm. But we are speaking literally. Scotus would agree with that. When it comes to the earthy things that we've been thinking about here, Aquinas does say, well, these are metaphorical. When we talk about God as a lion or a lamb, that's metaphorical.
Yeah.
And he kind of has an implicit theory of metaphor as sort of property overlap, basically, that a lion has great power and in that sense is like God. And so the concept of the lion and the concept of God overlap at this point, and that's how metaphor works implicitly for Aquinas. All right, but now, so why would he say that about God's leonine aspect, merely metaphorical, but not say that God's wisdom or love are merely metaphorical? And here, I think part of the reason, part of what's going on is the way in which Aquinas yields God's ideas of creatures. And what I mean by that is this. Aquinas, like Scotus and almost every medieval Christian philosopher, thinks that God has these ideas that are in some sense ideas of himself, but he inserts a step to, so to speak, generate or explain how God's one simple idea of himself can be ramified into these many facets. And the step is this, that God, in perfectly knowing himself, would know every possible way in which he could be imitated.
Yeah.
And so God's idea of an imitation, a possible imitation of himself, just is God's idea of a purely creaturely way of being.
Mm.
And so we can, maybe distinguish for Aquinas the attributes that characterize what God is in himself from all of the, lower down creaturely ways of being that are originally thought of merely as ways God can be imitated.
Yeah. So we could put the mustache somewhere in there too.
Somewhere in there, that there's something, that God, to have perfect self-knowledge, God would have to know all of the ways that he could be imitated. That's a claim of Aquinas. I'm a little skeptical of that claim, but it's a plausible claim.
Yeah.
He would have, as a condition on perfect self-knowledge, he would have to have ideas of every possible imitation. And there's some reality to a mustache, so that at some, almost infinitesimally small level, there's a way in which a mustache resembles God.
Mm-hmm.
And so God would have an idea of it that way.
Yeah.
Scotus, and I try to develop a more Scotist line of thought in the book. And I mentioned that I originally get it from Scotus, but it's not Scotus scholarship or Scotus interpretation.
Yeah.
But Scotus rejects this imitation thought. He certainly thinks that God would be aware of all of the ways that creatures imitate or resemble God. But he thinks that God can't get his ideas of creatures merely by understanding how he can be imitated.
Mm-hmm.
It's, so to speak, the imitation relation has to relate something that's already there.
Yeah.
So you need the relatum of the imitation relation, in some sense, prior to the imitation. And so you need and God would need to know the relatum, so to speak, in itself, prior to knowing the way that it imitates him.
Is that I think you make I think you raise that as an objection against God makes stuff up, right? He can't just make it up.
Yeah. Well, I think God can't. I deny that God can just make stuff up, and by that I mean that have a thinking of something that is a thinking up of something that is utterly original.
Mm-hmm.
And the main reason I deny that is that such a thinking up would not be a rational activity. God could not know what he's doing.
Because there's no it's not related. There's no relatum.
Yeah. I was inspired by this. I was inspired by Brian Leftow, who makes similar comments in his big God and Necessity book.
Yeah.
That a truly originative thinking up would lack this condition of intentionality. Even if you build in, God is intending to make up something original, and so he's like setting himself up to be surprised or something like that.
Yeah.
That seems fine for less than perfect creative agents, but not fine for something that is necessarily ignorant, necessarily not ignorant.
Yeah. Can I stay on that point really quick about less than perfect creative agents? So some might be saying I really like the authorial analogy for the God world relation. God's like an author, but I think you used maybe painting or an artist or something. So that someone might say, hey, look, there's this beautiful picture of Aslan in the Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois, and someone painted that, picture of this beautiful lion, and yet they aren't leonine. And so I'm I'm assuming, maybe I read it in your book, that you would say, well, there's asymmetry between the two because the painter is a sub-creator, to quote Tolkien, and we human beings, created creators, can never come up with something ex nihilo because we're always pulling from creation. But then likewise, God's not creating ideas ex nihilo, right?
Hmm.
So would you say there is that asymmetry relation, or lack of relation between the created painter and God, the painter of reality?
Yeah, that's one of the ways where the analogy breaks down. Um, you know, again, you might think, before you get too much in the weeds on all this, all these fine points, you might think, actually, as I think about it a little bit, the painter who can paint something that is something genuinely other than herself, like that's real creativity. Wow. And so you think, well, maybe God's creativity is like that,
Hmm.
where he really does just make something brand new. But I do, I mean, and there's something very attractive about that picture to me. And I even kind of, in an earlier article, I defended something more like that. But I was led away from it ultimately because, again, this concern about preserving God's perfect knowledge in everything that he's doing.
Yeah.
And reflecting that while it is impressive that an artist can paint things other than herself, it's actually the artist is dependent on other things existing. It's not as though the artist of that lion painting gets, just thought up the lion. He or she had to be in contact with other lions, reading about them in books or going to the zoo to look at them. So there's a dependence there that doesn't seem to attribute to God. If we're trying to push that analogy as far as we can, it's like, well, there is something impressive about making something that is not at all like yourself. But then a condition on doing that would be depending on something else for that kind of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you say, well, no, God just makes stuff up. We're not saying that he depends on anything outside of him. We're not saying that he's turning inward and finding all the created ways of being within himself. Let's just say he just thinks up stuff and then stocks himself with ideas that way, utterly original,
Mm-hmm.
and then makes a world on the basis of whatever these things that he's thought up. And again, the basic objection there is God would make up these basic ingredients of created ways of being in a totally non-rational way, because he couldn't know prior to thinking them up what he was doing.
Right.
Except at a very general level of description, like, what am I doing? I'm thinking stuff up.
Yeah.
In that sense, he would know what he's doing. But but he could not, and here I'm following Leftow pretty closely, but he could not intend to think up the lion.
Yeah.
And that just seems like I'm not willing to withhold that kind of intentionality from God. So, but then if we say God does intend to create lions, God does eternally know all about lions. Not because some other God has already made a world that has lions in it, not because there are abstract objects of lions. God just knows the lion for always.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, yeah, it's because what it is to be a lion is part of what it is to be God.
Yeah. So God, and this is great. So God had lions or leonine attributes, just lions in mind before he created. Otherwise, he's rational, and you have this action without intention when that seems crazy, or you have to make a broad general intention of creativity in the abstract. So that I'm with you. I think that's crazy. Maybe we can get into a little bit of your arguments against abstractionism, which is just a Platonic realm existing alongside of him, which like PVI I think holds, and I think Keith Yandel maybe too. But that one to me just seems so implausible. It seems so Christian, I guess. I love those guys, but I like, as a Christian, I'm like, no, dude, I don't want to have a abstract realm alongside of God. I think that kind of falls prey to the Euthyphro dilemma, though they could defend that, they're way smarter than me. But why not have divine ideas be, why not the Augustinian route or the Philo route of there's a concept of lion which eternally exists. Greg Welty is a modern proponent of this. Theistic conceptual realism, that these concepts don't depend on God because he didn't invent them, and yet they do. He might say something different about lions, but like the law of non-contradiction or logical law, something like that, are divine ideas, but they just eternally exist as his ideas. But you don't you say something different than that, right?
Yeah, I am really attracted to that conceptual framework, and in the book, I say something like, "This is a pretty good view. Why do we want to keep pushing here?"
Yeah.
And in the end, I think we can push a little bit more and get a little bit more explanation, and that doing like the little bit more explanation makes a little bit more sense metaphysically, and really gives us this, I think, profoundly inspiring vision of the whole created order as representing God in a real way. But here's so this extra little push that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's to say, like, on the conceptualist view, you get these concepts that have, lion content or mustache content. They're not about anything, because prior to creation, there's nothing for them to be about. There's just, if you just try to think of the content of a mustache without the reference to or the aboutness of an idea to a mustache. And I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
That picture of an idea that in one important sense is not about anything. But on the exemplarist view that I advocate, we can say they are about something. They're about God. Now, what's the cost of doing that? Well, we end up having to say that there is this mysterious kind of leonine aspect about God, or mustachioed aspect about God, and a lot of people are going to think that that's really strange, even if they won't think it's strange to talk about God being loving or wise or a father, and so on. So I understand that hesitation, but what we gain, I think, is a deeper explanation of why there are the divine ideas there are. If on the conceptualist view, there's something just as primitive about God's having the concepts that he has as there is about a Platonic realm having just the Platonic objects it has.
Yeah.
Like, well, why does God eternally have the concept of a lion? Is it just because? And like that kind of, God's having lion content in mind eternally just seems to cry out for explanation.
Yeah.
And the conceptualist ultimately can't give it. The conceptualist might be able to give a story about how God's ideas are are like categorically structured, you know, in a big Porphyrian tree or something like that, and so you could get some kind of derivation or grounding relationships between different ideas that would offer partial explanations. Of course, you could get that on an exemplarist view too. But I think what exemplarism gives you is an answer to the question: why does God eternally have lion content in mind? Well, because he eternally thinks himself. Now, can we give an explanation of why lion content is part of the divine essence, partially constituted of the divine essence? No, we can't give an explanation of that. Okay. But then we've stopped at the right kind of spot.
Yeah, the buck stops with God. Yeah,
we really have stopped with God instead of. Someone criticized me for using this barnacle metaphor to talk about the conceptualist view. They're just kind of stuck on God like barnacles on a whale.
Yeah.
And I meant it. I did not mean it pejoratively, but I understand why someone took issue with it.
Yeah, I don't know why thinking of a barnacle analogy or metaphor would be wrong. Yeah. How can anyone take that the wrong way?
Yeah. But if I offended any of my conceptualist friends out there by the image of the barnacle, I'm really sorry about that. I meant no offense. But it was just meant to show that the whale really it's supporting the barnacle, but the whale isn't providing any explanation of why the barnacle is there, why the barnacle has just that shape and color and size and so on. It's just stuck on. So the only explanatory advantage of exemplarism over conceptualism is that little extra push. We get God at the end of our explanation instead of something that God thinks at the end of our explanation. And I think that's satisfying, not just on purely religious grounds. Again, alluding back to our earlier part of the conversation about wanting to give God as much glory as possible, but also on metaphysical grounds. If you're a theist, it makes more sense for God to be the buck stops here explanation of everything everything that God could possibly be a buck stops explanation of.
Yeah. So, man, I'm getting a little feedback too.
Again. I can't hear anything.
Okay. It's going away now. I don't know why it does that, but so this makes sense for me when it comes to possibilities, necessities, like the law of non-contradiction. Welty and Anderson's paper, The Lord of Non-Contradiction. I asked Dr. Anderson on one of our episodes about a kind of a truth maker theory to go further than there. So they have this necessary truth, this proposition, the law of non-contradiction, and pick whatever logical or necessary truth that you want. So God's nature is the truth maker, which makes that proposition true. So you have the truth bearer and the truth maker, and you have this grounding relationship. That makes a lot of sense. And it wasn't until reading your account here that I don't know if you'd want to be committed to a truth maker kind of theory or anything like that. You might be even talking about something different, but it's the same kind of thing, that God's nature is grounding the Leonine attributes as well. Just like I wanted to ground the law of non-contradiction, not only just find it in God's mind, but ground it actually in his nature.
Yeah, that's good. I don't think, in general, I don't think about propositions too much. And
I mean, yes and no, right? You don't think about them, but you do think your thoughts have propositional content.
I think by means of propositions. But what I mean there is that the kind of reification of propositions that many analytic philosophers do is it's a world I know a lot about. I studied it in grad school, but it's not my philosophical parlance. I don't really have strong views about what propositions are. Of course, I don't think that they're abstract objects. Does God have a propositional structure in his thoughts? I don't know. So I'm not committed one way or another
Yeah.
about propositions. But the general point, there's deep accord there.
Okay.
You don't just stick thoughts in God's mind. You make God have something to do with either the existence of the thought itself, the content of the thought, or the truth of the thought, if the thought is truth valuable. That God has something. God is the reason for the truth, the content, even the reality of the thought that is in his mind.
Yeah.
So at that level, yeah, deep concord.
Okay. Okay. Just a few more things that I gotta ask you about. So, what about evil? Does this position, like, are you forced into a privationist view of evil?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I embrace that independently of the exemplarist view that I develop here. So, yeah, evil as corruption of the good, or evil as lack of goodness where goodness should be.
Okay.
There are no things, no realities that are intrinsically evil, so that there is no aspect of God that is evil. If
Yeah.
like cockroaches and mosquitoes, they're just evil.
Always cockroaches. Yeah. I hate cockroaches.
So do I. I really do. But like, no, I don't. Either they're a corruption of some like originally good little bug, and maybe a
Yeah.
demon got in there and them, like Sauron and the orcs. Maybe. I don't have an opinion about that.
Yeah.
But whatever is real about a cockroach, there's the cockroach aspect of God, and I'm fine with that. Privation theory. I think some people get uncomfortable with the thought of viruses being real but not evil. That doesn't bother me at all. I mean, of course, a virus can be bad for us, but something's being bad for us doesn't make it bad. There's something real to being a virus, that God has some kind of creative control over whether or not this world will be a world in which viruses exist and which kinds of viruses exist. And so I'm fine with that. I think the harder stuff for privation, to pull off a privation theory of evil, the harder part is to think about evil acts.
Yeah.
And, like an act of murder, there's something real about an act of murder.
Yeah.
So what's the privation theory of evil analysis of an act of murder? What's the thing that's missing, or the thing that's gone wrong? Is it the mere fact that it's a killing? Is it the mere fact of the knife piercing flesh? It becomes hard to locate just where the privation is.
Right.
In evil acts.
Right, because a knife can cut cheese, and that's a good thing because it's good. But so then, if you want to make it that, but then there's this whole depiction of the whole action of murder and the intention behind it and stuff, or maybe even the intention, right? So if, depending on what you mean by thoughts, if thoughts exist or don't exist, there's an evil thought of intending to murder, which seems like it's a thing. But I'm sympathetic to privationist theories. I just wanted to see if it
but I think that's where all the really hard work has to be done, is in the analysis of evil acts.
Okay.
That's where I have run into most of my puzzles, but so far I still feel confident that it can be pulled off.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't mean to add on just a small topic of evil at the end of our.
You brought that up, though. That it does require a very. What I think of the privation theory of evil as a fundamentally joyful metaphysics, that things are good.
Things are good. Yeah.
So yeah, you have to embrace that, but it's worth embracing.
Yeah, sure. It's a good thing to embrace. Okay, and then I'm sure someone's thinking about volunteerism. Does this commit you to like volunteerism? And I would initially, before you answer, I would say probably not, because there is something leonine about God himself, and so he couldn't make a different. Well, could he have? I don't know. Maybe you just answer. What do you make of like volunteerism? Could God have made a square circle or a triangle that was a circle, or not just the language, right, but the actual essence of the thing that we have? His could he have changed his divine ideas?
No, no, because he can't change himself.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
That's the idea.
Boom.
And I think that that God's thinking is ordered by principle of non-contradiction and so on. And so I would reject divine ideas of square circles
Okay.
for that reason. Now, saying that is consistent with saying that God might be able to think through some problem that we could never, if we attempted to think about something, we could only think of it as contradictory or something like that, because we just can't think well enough about it. And maybe God, knows the special theorem that makes it all work or something like that. But I don't have any,
Right.
I have zero reason to think that that's the case when it comes to something like a square circle.
Okay. So God might have the answer. We might get to heaven and he'll tell us the answer for the liar paradox or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah. Okay. You've given me so much of your time. This has been fantastic. Sorry, real quick.
Yeah, so, I'm in no ruch. So if you
okay, great.
It's just fine. Right. I'm having a lot of fun.
Well, this has been fantastic for me. You brought up another pretty weird thing that I thought was so interesting about abstracta, and you're saying you might be sympathetic. I don't know if it was SCOTUS or you're pulling it for someone. You might be sympathetic to like an angelic like being type thing. So like an angel having dominion, or a angelic type being having dominion over squares or over triangles. And it's got this like Charles Williams, the place of the lion, type thing going on. Can you say, it's not a huge part of your book. I just grabbed it because I thought it was so interesting. I know it's not something you've defended a ton or anything like that. Can you just broach that for us?
Yeah. I mean, when I bring it up in the book, the context is I think a brief discussion about what kinds of criteria we should use to adjudicate theories, or competing theories. So nowadays we are really into simplicity, elegance, parsimony, these kinds of things.
Yeah. And
the principle of parsimony, what we call Occam's razor, which is Aristotle's razor. I mean, it's not original to Occam. It's a quotation from Aristotle. Almost all medieval philosophers use the principle of parsimony. So it's not as though parsimony was foreign to these people, but in our own day, parsimony, simplicity are the main criteria. And of course, coherence. Like, assuming coherence, then what else do we look for as a guide to truth? But when you have this view about the great chain of being and the plenitude of what is real, just as interested as medieval philosophers were in parsimony, they were equally interested in a universe that had no gaps.
Mm-hmm.
So wherever there was ontological space for something to be, even if it wasn't observed, even if there were no other good arguments for its existence, it was considered reasonable to posit the existence of a thing occupying that gap. So why are there angels? Well, because there's a kind of fittingness that the world would have material, non-rational beings, rational material beings, and rational immaterial beings. And angels are the rational immaterial beings. So there's this kind of principle of plenitude that's at work in theories. And I think what I was trying to do there in the section of the book you're alluding to was just say, I do think my theory is good on grounds of simplicity and elegance, but I don't want to make that the ruling criteria of whether the theory is a good to be accepted or not, because I'm kind of attracted to this idea of plenitude as providing a good key to what things there are. Yeah. So this idea of ruling intelligences and so on, you might think, well, there's just something abundant, like something grossly overabundant about that ontology.
Yeah.
Like, well, why not? I mean, God clearly is not very efficient in the way that he set things up, right? Like human salvation, depending on, the church, like behaving itself and going out to all the world and sharing the gospel and so on. It's like, really? I mean, he wants helpers, even at the cost of a lack of efficiency. Mm-hmm. That seems to be something we learn about God. And so why not in the angelic realm have something like sub-creative ministers, like Angel 45 is the oak tree guy.
Yeah.
And so when God says, let there be oak trees, it's ex nihilo, but it's ultimately ex nihilo, but it's somehow ordered through these other creative spirits. Yeah. So it was an example. I mean, I was thinking actually of Tolkien's cosmology that he offers in the Silmarillion, where in Tolkien's world, the Eru, the one god, creates these angelic-like beings or gods, little g gods, and then they are involved in the creation of Middle-earth.
Yeah, they join in the singing, right?
Yeah, they join in the singing. Yeah. So I mean, I have no dogmatic commitment to
right.
that works like that.
Yeah.
I was holding it out there as as an example of how too strong a commitment to simplicity and parsimony might close us off from thinking as plausible views that are more complicated, but maybe closer in line with how God seems to want to work in creation. I mean, there's something about the very fact of a world that exists, a created world, is itself kind of the inefficiency, the rejection of a simple cosmos. God didn't need anything.
Yeah.
And so the fact that anything exists at all shows that God himself is not that into simplicity. And so why our theories of things should be adjudicated on the basis of simplicity and parsimony, I think is itself a kind of methodological, not mistake. I'm not willing to go that far, but it's an under-scrutinized methodology. And that as Christian philosophers, maybe we shouldn't feel beholden to it.
Yeah, I brought it up partially to emphasize that. I'm sorry, I'm getting my feedback, but it's going away again. I brought it up because it further emphasizes your emphasis on God's personality, that God's a person. He's a creative person. And I love that you said God's not efficient because, again, I love the authorial analogy. And I would say the point of reality is God telling a story. And if he wanted to be a mathematical, logic chopper, he could have done it way more efficiently. But he did it because he's a person. He's not just Philo's engineer. He's not just planning up but he's telling a rich story. Even our natural language is so hard to analyze formally because it's so rich, and that's like the world. And I thought that was a really interesting point. A theologian, John Frame, talked about this once, and he had to write a paper kind of giving an ancient view of the world, and he wrote about angels shaking the trees. And he's like, I accidentally convinced myself, and I don't know if I'm totally held to it, but it's kind of a similar idea that there's like an angel in charge of the wind and making the trees shake. And so even though it's compatible with science, right, it'd be extra. And so the principle of parsimony would say cut it off, but it might be the way that things are because God is a storytelling God, and there's this angelic realm of story going on, because why not have more story?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I sometimes tell my students about the scene in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader when they meet a star.
I think that might have been in the book too, but I'm not sure. You
Um,
quoted the Voyage of the Dawn Treader in there, but man, maybe not.
I don't think I did this part, but
Okay.
I might have, because I do share this a lot. But Ramandu is a star, but he looks like a dude. So okay, that's weird, but we're in a fairy tale. All right. And he goes on to explain that he's a retired star, and the kids are just amazed, as you'd expect they would be. And one says, in our world, stars are just a bunch of flaming gas.
Yeah.
And Ramandu says, even in your world, child, that is only what they are made of.
Yeah.
And so then you get this wonderful rehearsal of this view about heavenly spheres that goes all the way back to Aristotle and before, where the matter that we could see really is just something like the body or the material of a star, but each one is an intelligence. Why do the planets move in perfectly circular motion around the Earth? Well, because they have an intelligent pilot guiding them. Now, some of that, I don't think there's anything wrong with eschewing some of their astronomy, but yeah, to the basic fact of like the appearance of things might lead us to think of things more simplistically than God would have us think of them as.
Yeah. So, sorry. Go ahead, Dr.
No, I'm into that. Again, it's the sort of thing where it would be strange to develop a very confident view that every time the wind blows, some angel named Bob was like,
yeah.
But to be open to that kind of superabundance of being within God's created world, to have the personal implicated in as much of the way things are as possible. I mean, I think holding ourselves open to all of these kinds of views is the right way to inhabit the world, even if it doesn't change, credences about particular propositions about an angel being here or there doing such and such.
Yeah. I love that point. Chesterton talks about that a little bit with like symmetry, and in talking about God's creativity. And he's like, if you look at the human body, you see a lung on this side, a lung on this side, you see two hands, then you see a heart on this side, and oh, there's not a heart on that side, right? And so it's not all this symmetrical, perfect analytic philosopher's dream, I guess, too, but or maybe mathematician or something like that. In closing up here, I wanted to just briefly broach God's own existence and his idea of his existence. So you got guys like Hugh McCann and Descartes who say God's responsible for his own existence. I like Hugh McCann, but he's got some really weird views too. Like, I really like him, but he's got some interesting stuff that I disagree with. What do you make? Is God's existence? Is it a brute fact? We kind of talked about how the buck stops with him. Is God's nature, God's existence a brute fact?
Yeah. I can't make any sense of the causa sui view. If a thing is in need of being caused, it can't do anything until it has been caused.
Yeah.
So I understand, that it would be magnificent if God were so powerful that he could make even himself, or God were so powerful that he could have some sort of control over what his nature is. But in the end, I don't think any of these views make sense. Like literally, they're absurd. And so it's not so much like I'm not willing to give God this great thing. I'm not willing to assert nonsense.
Yeah. And so, as it turns out, if it is nonsense, it's not such a great thing after all. You know, you'd be
Well, yeah,
asking God to be nonsensical, and that is nonsensical.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, so we covered a lot here, but there's actually a lot more that your book touches on, and you get into you talk about transcendentals, which is fantastic. I love anytime someone's bringing that language back. That was really fun.
Yeah.
The book's great. It's short. It's like I said, it's a Cambridge Elements book, so it has to be short. But it's a great book. I recommend all the listeners check that out. And then, Dr. Ward, I was looking at your blog this morning, and you talked about I forgot who you're putting in conversation, but you had Iluvatar and maybe Scotus or someone why Iluvatar is not God. So it's really fun. That's the kind of like philosophy and philosophical theology I love. So can you point our listeners to your website or where they can find more of your work?
Good. Well, thanks, Parker. I really appreciate that. But I do have a website, thomasmward.com, THOMAS, M as in Michael, Ward. And I'm a lazy blogger, so it's only every now and then. And even the fact that I blog shows that I'm like getting pretty old, because I think I should be doing like a Substack or something. Isn't that what the kids are doing now?
Yeah, something.
Yeah, but I'm there is I should say I don't have a link yet because it's only been recently accepted, but in the Divine Ideas book, Scotus makes some appearances, but I don't do a lot of Scotus interpretation or anything. Partly it's because I wanted the theory to stand on its own,
Yeah.
And not just be historical work. But I've just written a book, which is an introduction to Duns Scotus.
Oh,
It's
wow.
called Ordered by Love, an introduction to Duns Scotus. And it was written kind of in the mode of Chesterton's book on Aquinas. If you've read that before, The Dumb
I haven't
Ox.
read it, but I have it.
You're
Yeah.
familiar with it? Yeah,
Mhm.
it's not for specialists. It's trying to explain Aquinas in his case, Scotus in my case, trying to explain our figures in a way that educated non-specialists can understand. I'm really excited about it. It should be coming out next year. Scotus is in certain circles among Christian intellectuals, he's he's a polarizing figure.
Yeah.
A lot of people really don't like him. I've spent most of my career trying to rehabilitate Scotus for faithful Christians and try to make the case that he's not the bad guy he's been made out to be by a lot of people. And this book is kind of the fruit of my attempt to make that case. And then I probably won't write anything on Scotus ever again. It's sort of like my last word. So
Sure.
I'm excited to get the word out about the book. Ordered by Love, Angelico Press, coming out next year.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Maybe come back on. We could talk about that as well. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, that's going to have to do it, folks. We could talk about this more, and Lord willing, someday we will. But that's it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.